everybody. You guys ready to talk about Unit 5 land use stuff? It seems like 8 of you are here. I hope you have your questions. Hi, Dakota. Hi. I'm Skylar Fishman. I teach AP Environmental Science in Denver, Colorado. I also used to work as an environmental scientist. So we're going to talk about some land use issues tonight. And I hope you brought your questions. So I hope you got some questions. We're going to talk about the skill that is going to be 40% of the exam, proposing a solution and look at an exemplar. We are going to talk about objectives 514 through 517. Integrated pest management's a big one, especially for designing an investigation. Sustainable agriculture, aquaculture, and sustainable forestry. All right, let's take a look at this slide. The following 2 responses say the same thing. Why does one not receive full points and the other does not? I mean, other than the obvious, answer B is very short, but it is not true that writing more will always help you. So this is question part E of a dam question, if the dam were removed and hydroelectric power were no longer available, we're talking about Lake Powell and Lake Mead in the Southwest provide a lot of power to Los Angeles. So if we remove these dams to restore the ecosystem, propose a solution, and you're going to see this as one of your FRQ parts, for generating enough electric power to meet the needs of the Southwestern states. Go ahead and give it a guess. See if other than one is longer than the other or more detailed. Can we examine these 2 things to get some tips for yourself as to what kind of things you're going to need to include from your notes? So answer A and answer B basically say the same thing. If the dam were removed, it would be sustainable to install solar energy in the southwestern United States. The reason behind this is because those states receive the most abundant amount or the most amount of sunshine in a year. There are more pros than cons, which make solar energy the best option. Solar energy doesn't make any noise pollution or air pollution. They require little maintenance, and installation pays off in the long term. While PV cells does require some fossil fuels, the pros outweigh the cons. And then answer B says, 2 solutions that can be proposed is that we use solar and wind energy because they are cheaper and less risky. Anybody want to take a guess as to the specific things that really address this practice? Why did this student nail the points? Okay, well, the reason why I brought this up is because it's not enough just to push yourself to write more details. You want to have available advantages and disadvantages when you propose a solution. You want to be able to talk about the pros and the cons, and the CED even says that. This student did a really good job of specifically proposing a solution. Perhaps the one thing they didn't account for is what do you do if you're dependent on solar and there is no sun? So maybe they could have proposed a backup solution as well, because solar by itself needs either batteries or some kind of fossil fuel backup or some kind of biofuels or geothermal or consistent backup that happens even when it's not sunny or windy. This student did not say how this solution would work. So again, when you are proposing a solution, you want to use talk about advantages and disadvantages, consequences of potential solutions in detail to get full credit. I hope that example is helpful. Give me a thumbs up if you are like, okay, I get what I need to do. All right, so let's talk about integrated pest management. There are whole courses on integrated pest management, but it's also something that is fairly easy to understand if you understand the word integrated. Integrated. What does it mean when we integrate something? You can put it in the chat for us. What does integrated hint at? Or what is something else that's integrated that you know about? Yeah, Zoe, combining things together, introducing something new. You could think about school integration. So integrated pest management means let's use all the available methods instead of the just one pesticide method. And so in that way, it's a sustainable approach because it's very successful because you have a lot of options and it's research-based, meaning you decide on how you use these options based on data. It's also led to kind of a revolution in what's called smart farming, using sensors and monitors to decide what is applied when, using computers and AI. Most importantly, it is a solution. So if we're proposing solutions to conventional pesticides and herbicides, it is a very strong solution. And I think it's likely you could be asked about it because it is also something that you could design an investigation about. So what are the problems with conventional pesticides and herbicides? Well, pests become resistant over time because the pests that live on to reproduce are the ones that are resistant. So they pass on that resistant gene through the process of natural selection. Bioaccumulation in ecosystems. So those pests ingest some of that pesticide and then their predators have more of that pesticide in them because of the trophic pyramid. Pesticide treadmill, where like you have that resistance and then you use more pesticide and they become more resistant, and then you introduce a new pesticide and they become resistant to that. So that is called the pesticide treadmill. You then have developed a biome in your agricultural field that has no naturally beneficial pests and therefore is more susceptible to pests. And so you have to apply more pesticides. So you're creating the problem you're trying to solve. Integrated pest management also solves the problem of the fact that pesticides are not targeted generally. They're broad spectrum. And so they kill everything, even the things that you may want. For example, fungicides have been shown to have a negative effect on pollinators. So you thought you got rid of pests, but now you don't have any pollinators for your crops, and that affects the productivity of your crops. So describing that problem is really important before you propose a solution. Why would we want integrated pest management? Well, because it is an alternative to monoculture industrial ag, heavily reliant on chemical pesticides and herbicides. All right, so I would definitely have that bullet list kind of for myself to be able to explain what the problem is with using chemical fertilizers. We didn't talk about water pollution because it's in Unit 8, but we also have problems with surface runoff with the application of pesticides and unintentional spread to local ecosystems. All right, so what is it? It consists of 4 basic parts, and those parts are used together in this sort of pyramid fashion so that chemicals are the last resort. And so it relies on consistent monitoring. So cultural involves the types of plants and insects that are used. It also includes what kind of soil amendments and nutrients are in the soil, how the soil is terraced. It's the idea of what are you growing and how are you growing it. Let's put questions in the question place, but I'm going to go back. I'm going to backpedal for a second because I saw it. Dakota, with IPM, is it typically non-invasive species? Do you mean the beneficial species that are used as a control, or do you mean the pests that we're trying to control? Generally, all pests that affect agricultural fields are considered invasive in some way. Well, the beneficial ones are typically non-invasive species. That is correct, because if you use an invasive species to control one species that is native, then you're going to have a new problem that doesn't belong in that biome. So that's a really good question, and you're thinking about this in the right way. Generally, will be a non-invasive species. It may not always be a native species, because you've got to think about an agricultural field, and even if it's sustainable, it's not a native biome. It's not a native ecosystem to be growing crops in what would be a grassland, or what would be a highland, or what would be a savanna, or what would be a prairie. So cultural is what you are growing together and how. Mechanical is barriers, traps, physical removal. Biological, think pests that prey on other, I should say pests, I'm so sorry. Think pests that prey on other pests. Here's an example of a ladybug. Ladybugs eat aphids. So if one pest eats the other, in my favorite movie of all times that they show sustainable agriculture, The Biggest Little Farm, they bring in ducks to control snails. The snails are an invasive problem. They're eating the peach trees. The ducks love the snails, and then they fertilize the peach trees as they're walking around eating the snails. It's a great solution. And so often these solutions are using the food web to try and keep things in balance. So ladybugs killing aphids, chickens that eat pests. For example, if you have a problem with caterpillars, caterpillars eating all your grasses or your wheat. Chickens love caterpillars. They also love grasshoppers, which can be a pest that destroys crops. And then they poop around your crops. So they're providing natural mulch and fertilizers. Physical mechanical would be insect traps, or creating barriers around the plant, cones around the bottom, or really literally just physical removal, going and picking them off at key times in the reproductive cycle of those pests. So using the reproductive cycle is really important. Intercropping is a good example of a cultural part of IPM. For example, marigolds next to tomato plants. Marigolds act as a natural insect repellent, and then they're a barrier. So pests don't tend to get on the tomato plants because of the marigolds. All of these things have to be balanced together and use monitoring and data. For example, the timing of when you do these things. For example, if you apply pheromones to disrupt the reproductive cycle of a certain pest, that has to be done at the right time. And if you do it at the right time, you don't have to apply it all the way through the growing season. You do it once, and then you don't have pests come back for the rest of the growing season. So understanding these different parts of IPM is really critical. Having some examples in your pocket that make sense to you that you can explain. Are there any questions about what is cultural, what's mechanical, what's biological, and what's chemical? So like I said earlier, because integrated pest management is an integrated approach of putting many things together strategically, it requires a lot of monitoring and data collection to make the most efficient choices to reduce pest damage. Remember, even if we're working for sustainable agriculture, we want to be able to send those apples to market without the wormholes. Like, nobody wants to buy even organic produce if it's damaged to a certain point and it's unsellable. So you're maximizing all of these strategies together. You have to use data. So I don't know, how many of you have been doing some of the practice FRQs on AP Classroom? There are quite a number of them, and a lot of them are optional for you, and also have the scoring guidelines, which I think is a great way to practice. Try it and then check and see, and that feedback cycle is going to help you really prepare. So this is 2020. Practice FRQ number 2. Anybody seen this before? Give me a thumbs up in the chat. Okay. All right. So the beginning of this question, I'm not going to go over because it has to do with invasive species, and they're just asking you to identify characteristics. Okay, so Zoe's seen it before. So you know, they ask you to identify characteristics of a native species, of an invasive species that makes it outcompete. And they ask you to I-squared the graph, meaning like talk about when are these two grass species in 50-50 competition, and as opposed to like what happens in the end, which is overall the productivity goes down. They ask you to interpret that graph. And in the end, what do you guys think? The invasive grass, does the invasive grass win out? Well, don't take a guess. Yeah, because it's increasing. Yeah. And there will be more invasive. That's right, Zoe. There'll be more invasive than native grass. And so, and overall, the productivity of both grasses is actually just totally decreasing. So it's affecting biodiversity. So if this were your nature preserve or your park or your land even, and you wanted to get rid of this invasive grass, what is a physical IPM approach to controlling the invasive, it should say invasive grass, not invasive grass, I apologize. So what would be a physical approach? Take a wild guess. So Zoe says introduce bugs who eat the grass. So it's important, that's biological, right? If you're introducing something, right, that's living, then that is a biological strategy. Think physical as in you have to use your physical body. Manual destruction. That's right. And in a lot of cases, this was a huge problem in Hawaii with invasive grasses such as Bermuda grass, actually going in and physically pulling out this grass. And if you do it at the wrong time, then you spread the seed. Anybody who's had a garden can tell you, you've got to weed it. Then that is a physical IPM practice. Even if you're trying to grow those crops for money, pulling weeds is still, one of the oldest, wisest, best strategies. If you do it at the right time, many, many years in a row, you might luckily innovate and not have to get rid of it. So in this case, that's exactly what the researchers did. So they asked you to describe the process of IPM as an environmental solution. As you know, we're looking for details. The ecologists want to begin their IPM program with physical control in a managed area. So that is not in a lab, that is in situ, but it's managed, meaning they have plots, they're measuring things, they maybe have a large fence around that plot. It's an open system, but it's managed. They established a 10-hectare plot in which they tested their efforts. So that's rather large, actually. Based on the data in the graph and the information provided, identify a testable scientific question that the ecologists could use to guide their physical control efforts. So they're asking for a scientific question, which is kind of like what the hypothesis is an answer to. So we're getting into that practice number 5. Describe a reasonable research method that the ecologists could use in their physical control efforts. Part 3 here would probably be about 4 points. They're looking for you to fully describe a research method that they could use to test physical control efforts. Okay. So let's look at the first one. Let's look at this student response. What do you think about this student response? It's a response to all 3 of these. You can ask a question about it. Maybe you can decide what is missing. Maybe you can decide what is strong. I'll read it out loud because it is a lot of text. Right, manual destruction. So IPM is a means of removing or controlling a pest population without the use of pesticides, which leaves the environment they inhabit safe for the dangers of traditional pest management. The ecologists know that invasive grasses are outcompeting native grasses in drought conditions. That was mentioned in the question. They should test whether or not they only outcompete the native grasses in droughts or in other conditions. Ecologists should water certain areas of the 10-hectare plot to simulate normal conditions and leave others as is to simulate the drought conditions. This would tell the ecologist whether or not the invasive grasses only outcompete native grasses in drought conditions. So it seems like a good description, right? For part I, that was a 2-point question. Part I, how many points do you think this student got? Yeah, yes. A really picky reader might say, well, it's not without the use of pesticides. There are sometimes pesticides used, or saying chemical controls, because things like diatomaceous earth, which is basically just like seashells that are made into a powder that irritate pests and keep them away as or barriers or things like that. They really didn't mention the 4 parts of IPM. And so a reader might only give them 1 point for not being specific enough of what the means of controlling it is. Because all they said was it's a means of controlling a pest without doing harm to the environment. That's true. But to really describe it, we need to say it's a process of using those controls, prioritizing physical prevention, then moving, and by also using cultural strategies of intercropping or ways of situating what is planted and what is in the soil and balancing the nutrients. And then when physical and cultural don't work, biological controls are introduced at strategic times. And when those don't work, chemicals are applied as needed at critical times. So I would say this student didn't get the full points because they identified IPM and they said one thing about it, but they didn't describe, and I'm going to go back for a second. They didn't describe these 4 aspects of it and the fact that it happens in a strategic sequence. We try and prevent the pests, in part by using cultural methods and then physical removal. We use biological controls if those don't work, and then we use chemical methods. So that is why that student for part I did not get full credit. The ecologists want to begin their IPM program with physical control methods. Identify a testable scientific questions that ecologists could use to guide their physical control efforts. All right. So again, this is an identify. It's actually just 1 point. Is there a testable scientific question in this paragraph that guides the physical control efforts? All right, Dakota, what is it? Is it going to get points? Think about it, people. The more you participate, the better the practice is. And Dakota had a question about the previous part. Would it be better to say that it doesn't use traditional pesticides or traditional chemicals? I would just say, you could just say it doesn't use chemical pesticides or synthetic pesticides. The word synthetic meaning human-made as opposed to organic, like diatomaceous earth, things that are derived, or insect pheromones, chemicals that are derived organically. But you could just say pesticides. Thanks for putting that question in the question bank. I see that there's a lot of people here. Make sure that you are getting what you need out of this review. Yeah, so Dakota's identified that this student has said the testable question is to see whether native grasses or invasive grasses can survive drought conditions perhaps better. My question is, does that address physical control efforts, or did maybe perhaps the student didn't understand what physical control efforts meant? Do you think he got the point? Yeah, so a physical control method is either a barrier or because we're not talking about pests here, we're talking about invasive species and other grass, physical removal is actually going to be the main thing they're talking about. Physical control efforts, removal for the grass. They didn't get the point because their scientific question doesn't address physical control. So we've already said physical control in this case has to be either a barrier or removal, right? So either a barrier that doesn't allow the seeds of that invasive species to enter, or a physical barrier on top of the soil with mulch like you would with a weed. And so this question is really asking them to not just create an experiment, which this is a perfectly great testable question that has to do with the topic, but it didn't get the point, because the point asked about designing a testable scientific question that they can use to make decisions about physical control. So that would be something like maybe the frequency of removal or the number of barriers. The independent variable needs to be identified in this testable question. How does the frequency of removal lower the abundance of invasive grasses? Or how does the timing of removal, when is it removed? Or how does such and such a barrier decrease the number of invasive species? Okay, or increase the abundance of the native species. That would gain a point. So this looks like a great answer, and that's why FRQs are hard, but you can do it. I know you can, and it's about tuning into what they're specifically asking you about the content. This student did not probably know what physical control efforts were. So there's no control effort in this question. This question is just about whether these grasses can survive drought or not. And that's not what we want to test. We are in a drought, but we want to know what is the best IPM solution during the drought to help the native grasses survive and to control the invasive species. Okay, great question. And then describing a reasonable research method. Well, his research method is very reasonable for his testable question. He doesn't have a hypothesis per se, but if he did, it would be that invasive grasses survive droughts better because they're generalists, or because they have more genetic diversity, or perhaps they're coming from someplace where their climate was different, and the climate was a drier climate, and because they're exotic, they have better skills to handle that. Okay. So that's IPM. I'm just going to go back for a minute, understanding the difference between these and that they're used in order to be strategic. We don't want to have to use chemical methods, but chemical methods can be part of IPM. All right. So sustainable agriculture. We have talked before, and you perhaps might be aware that the way that most of our food is produced is meant to be efficient and profitable and feed the most people as possible. So it is highly mechanized. It involves monocultures, and there are several problems about this. And again, proposing a solution means you can also identify and describe the problem. So we have loss of arable fertile topsoil because of erosion, compaction, desertification. We have an inefficient use of freshwater resources, groundwater depletion like the Oglala Aquifer, which covers 8 states. We have 70% of our freshwater use is for industrial agriculture in an inefficient way, using combines and spray that then causes a lot of evaporative losses. Spraying water in the air or flooding fields, which then cause salinization. We have nutrient pollution from using chemical fertilizers because we've lost our topsoil and we're not using compost the way that a natural ecosystem would replenish nutrients. We have the pesticide treadmill, which we already talked about, loss of biodiversity and habitat through GMOs, and also monoculture, growing, taking a very diverse prairie and making it all grow corn. That's going to deplete the nutrients. So again, I would have some of those problems in front of you so you can talk about them in detail, not just to mention groundwater depletion, but to go back and talk about irrigation methods. Why are we using this water so inefficiently, and that it's such a large percentage of fresh water? Is fresh water abundant on planet Earth above ground? Does anyone remember your percentages? No, right? It's like 2.5% of all water on Earth is above ground fresh water. Most fresh water is under the ground. It's you want to go look at that pie chart if you really want to quote percentages, but I don't think you need to. I think you just need to mention fresh water is not a renewable resource, especially groundwater, because its residence time takes thousands of years. So all of these environmental problems have solutions. That's the good news. So you'll notice I brought some of these over from the last slides. So loss of arable fertile topsoil. We have no-till agriculture, which means we're not digging up the soil with a big machine every time we replant. We're letting the topsoil lie. You can. There's also lay fallow. I didn't put that in the slide. I'll put that over here. Lay fallow. For example, part of my garden this year that grew corn last year, I won't plant anything this year in it because it's exhausted. I will maybe plant a cover crop and dig it in, or I might just mulch it and let the soil and the decomposers renew the nitrogen. Should say lay fallow, sorry. Contour plowing is in this picture over here. And that's a way to prevent soil erosion. This is also called terracing. And that's also demonstrated in my favorite movie, The Biggest Farm. And no, they didn't pay me to advertise it, but it is so cute. Inefficient use of freshwater resources. We have a picture here of drip irrigation. Can be very expensive, especially if you're growing large amount of crops. But once it's in, it's fairly easy to maintain. You're reducing the losses from evaporation. Okay. Furrow irrigation is digging these furrows. You can actually see that this drip irrigation is in a furrow, and then you can flood that furrow and it sinks deeper in. It allows to maximize infiltration. So if we're talking about inefficient use of fresh water and you want to describe the advantages and the disadvantages, you want to talk about the water cycle. Nutrient pollution, eutrophication. So how do we solve that? Well, instead of using chemical fertilizers, which also burn fossil fuels through the Haber process to make them, you have to like burn fossil fuels to pull nitrogen out of the air through the Haber process. Chemical fertilizers can run off, and because they can't be assimilated very easily, they cause eutrophication. They also tend to kill the microbiome, kill the natural bacteria and decomposers that would naturally restore nitrogen to the soil. So what are we going to do? We're going to compost or use manure, cow poop, using organic rather than synthetic fertilizers, or ecological-based approaches using the food web. Like I talked about, if you have sheep coming in to mow a cover crop under fruit trees, they're going to naturally fertilize it when they leave their poop behind. Or chickens, they're going to eat off the caterpillars and they're going to leave their chicken poop behind, which is excellent source of natural nitrogen. We have tons of compost that goes unused from cow poop, from contained animal feed operations. So it's a really good way to recycle. It's also a good mulch. And here I've shown you just like your average household kitchen scraps, right? Could be picked up. For example, in Boulder County, they pick up your compost for you with your trash, and then they give it to a private company that then makes compost from it, and then sells the compost back to individual private citizens and landscapers and for use for the city. So composting, like I have a worm bin in my classroom. Everybody throws their apple peels, or I did before I didn't have a classroom anymore. And the worms would eat the food waste. and we had compost for our plants. Pesticide treadmill and pesticide pollution. We talked about that with IPM. Permaculture is another strategy. It's fascinating. It's again using the food web and strategically picking what plants you're planting. For example, beans are nitrogen fixers. They tend to develop nodules on their roots that then encourage bacteria to fix nitrogen, and then you let the beans lay. You don't harvest them. You chop them up and dig them into the soil. Strategies. Oh, thank you, Dakota. Thank you. It is very fulfilling to be helping you guys get ready for this test, and I'm glad to see so many people here. You should ask questions if you're not getting the information, or let me know if I need to slow down. It is my pleasure. You guys are awesome. So can you think of the advantages and disadvantages of one of these solutions? Remember that practice number 7 isn't just about saying, use compost, right? That might be your identify. Identify one solution to the lack of nutrients in soil that has been repeatedly depleted through industrial agriculture. Identify. Great. You said use compost. Okay. That's identify. Describe. Propose a solution involves describing, talking about the advantages and disadvantages, evaluating it or comparing it to maybe even another solution. So could you maybe pick one of these and say one of the advantages of it is this, one of the disadvantages of it is that? Choose one of these blue problems and solutions. Loss of biodiversity and habitat, polycultures, and intercropping. And you can see some raised intensive beds here where they're maximizing the use of space, and then they have interspersed different beds growing different things. Or again, if you are of Aztec heritage, you will know that the Aztecs invented intercropping when they planted corn, beans, and squash together. And that's also a permaculture strategy because they are beneficial to each other and increases biodiversity and helps nutrient fixation because you have those legumes, those nitrogen fixers. Like what would be one of the disadvantages to using no-till agriculture? Like you grow your food, you're done, you're ready for the next year, and you're not going to dig up the soil. That's going to help preserve your topsoil. Ooh, polyculture is more expensive and reduces productivity. Good. But it increases the nutrients. Excellent. That's right. You might want to say, what productivity does it reduce? Because you could argue that that's not specific enough, right? You could say it reduces your yield. So if you want to talk specifically about the amount of food you get, we call it yield. If you want to talk about the productivity, what you're thinking is how fast those plants do photosynthesis, how much carbon they store, and you want to be specific with yield versus productivity, right? Or maybe you want to say it reduces your profits because your labor costs increase. Same thing with drip irrigation. The advantage is it reduces the use of valuable freshwater resources because there's less evaporation and more infiltration, but it's expensive and time consuming, and it needs maintenance. You could also say compost is expensive, or it takes time, right? Or it takes maintenance if you're going to use chicken poop. So you want to have those advantages and disadvantages. All right, I'm going to move on. If you have questions about sustainable ag, please put them in the ask a question, and I'll get back to them at the end. I think it's a fascinating topic. I think local urban gardening is also on the rise now that we're all staying home. I started an urban garden this week, and that, of course, reduces what? If we're all growing our food where we live, does anybody know what an advantage to that is? It's an advantage to urban agriculture. community gardens. If you don't need to buy your food at the grocery store, that means you don't need a truck to bring the food to the grocery store. That means there's going to be less. You aren't leaving the house much, which means you're not getting in the car, which means you are making less. Yes, exactly. And then again, you can't just say less CO2. You have to say less CO2, which is a greenhouse gas, which contributes to global warming. So go again, ask yourself and if. All right. Let's look at aquaculture. In Colorado, we have a place called the Gator Farm, and the Gator Farm started as a tilapia farm. Tilapia is a fish that grows really well in aquaculture, and you can go visit the gators and go see the tilapia and buy the fish. And but it basically started because they needed fish to eat the waste from the gators, so they got tilapia, which lives off the waste from the gators, and then that helped keep the water clean for the gators and recycle the water. And then they found they could sell the fish. But not all aquaculture is sustainable. So aquaculture literally means fish farming. Overfishing has depleted the global ocean fisheries, causing fisheries to collapse. So that started in the 60s. And we have international treaties. We have catch limits imposed by international organizations. There is the famous collapse of the Great Banks fishery, which there's a great YouTube video about. You can watch it. It's hard to enforce everybody with their catch limits, and also commercial fishing methods are way so competitive that they then outcompete the fish, basically. Like they're just taking way too much fish because they're so efficient, like dredging, like bottom trolling, like long lines. All those things are just so efficient at catching fish that they deplete the fish stocks. And that causes a lot of ecosystem problems because aquatic ecosystems tend to be very, they tend to always have like a third, fourth, fifth layer, which means you have more than one keystone species, as opposed to terrestrial ecosystems, which tend to, tertiary consumers are often the top predator. So this is a problem. And what happened in the 70s is that people started to grow fish. They started a fish farm, and the original fish farms were usually in offshore. They were not like in a warehouse in tanks like a lot of sustainable aquaculture is. And so they have a lot of problems. Just like CAFOs, you put a bunch of fish concentrated in an area in the ocean or in a bay, and what happens is the same thing. You have concentrated waste, you have disease, then you're applying antibiotics or medicines to try and prevent those diseases so you can sell that fish. The demand was way up, and so they started using GMOs, GMO fish, to try and have fish produce faster, and then those fish escaped and outcompeted other fish. So when you think aquaculture, think CAFO, contained animal feed operation, like with the same problem we have with beef production. Contained animal CAFOs were originally a solution to overgrazing, to the fact that we had too many cattle and they were grazing natural ecosystems way too fast, and then we didn't have any grass and the prairie would die and we had desertification. That's some of what has led to those large fires in Australia this year. So you can see aquaculture really took off. The demand for it was huge. Unfortunately, not a lot of it is sustainable. So again, before you can propose a solution, you will be asked to identify and describe the problem. So sustainable aquaculture, what is it? Well, it involves safe enclosures. That way, either if we're in situ, if we're in the ocean, if we're in a bay, if we're in a river, we definitely make sure none of that fish escapes, because it would be very, very dangerous. Waste management. So again, like I said, the Colorado Gator Farm, finding a way to composting and reusing that fish waste. The Gator Farm also sells fish emulsion, which makes a very smelly but fantastic fertilizer, especially for rose bushes. So making sure that you're recycling just like a natural ecosystem would. Water conservation, in other words, biological filtration methods, or even just wastewater treatment methods. So you're not releasing all of that nitrogen heavy water that you've used back into the environment without treating it, and consumer education. There are a number of websites that you can go to that talk about where to get fish that is sustainably farmed. Okay, so I'm going to go back. So we talked about the problems: waste contamination, fish escaping, use of antibiotics for disease. We solve those problems in sustainable agriculture. And there are some great college programs at many universities where you can study sustainable aquaculture. How are you going to farm fish for people in a way that doesn't impact the ocean? So all of those problems that you should be able to describe can be solved creatively. You don't so much have to memorize what sustainable solutions are. You have to think of a way that nature already solves that problem. For example, plants like nitrogen. So if you treat the wastewater from your aquaculture farm by putting it through a marsh, a man-made marsh, you're using nature to solve the environmental problem that man has created. But some of it is just physical and mechanical, right? Safe enclosures, building tanks, preventing fish from escaping. Disease prevention means you'd have to reduce the population density, maybe reducing your yield and your profit, but making sure you don't have too many fish per tank, and carefully screening for disease using genetic tests as well to screen for fish that are susceptible. Water conservation, biological filtration methods, composting, reusing fish waste as compost for rose bushes or selling to consumers. You can buy fish emulsion, which is basically fish poop, at a lot of garden stores. Consumer education. Like I said, there's a lot of websites that you can go to. And then sustainable forestry. So I talked about this a couple weeks ago for sustainability, but one of the barriers to sustainability is economics. And what is the reason for demand? In this country, we don't need to chop down our forests. We actually already have chopped down our forests. Now we're replanting our forests and managing our forests through selective harvesting, which means only taking a couple trees, shelter wood cutting, or seed wood cutting, so making sure that we're leaving an understory, maybe only cutting one or two big trees that actually are sheltering the younger ones. So when we cut them, we're giving some sunlight to some younger trees, allowing them to grow and take that place. Salvage logging, so taking out what is already dead. And then these other ones are really strategies that maybe in developing countries would be more appropriate. Conservation easements. So international organizations pay countries to set aside their forest as a preserve and not use the trees. Use of public lands. So again, allowing some people to buy up those lands, but then making them public. Tree planting. So a lot of nonprofits will pay people to go plant trees. I know I worked one summer planting trees in the Pacific Northwest as a way to mitigate or help. That's who was the alternative. Does anyone know why? Am I still glitching? Yeah. Sorry, folks. It's rush hour on the internet here in Colorado. Bamboo is actually an invasive species. Why is bamboo a good alternative or a solution for the demand we need for timber? Because normally we chop down trees to make our toilet paper, or we buy paper products that are made from trees. But why would growing bamboo and using bamboo be a sustainable solution? Yeah, it's super fast growing. It does have a high water demand, but there's other products too, like oriented strand board. There's ways to recycle wood and sawdust and use it into particle board, things that don't require us to chop down trees. That's a great question, Dakota. I am going to defer My best guess is that it is a grass. It has a lot of cellulose in it and grows extremely fast. Yeah, I don't think it's actually a tree, but don't quote me on it. I'm not a biologist. I'm an environmental scientist who wants to know more botany. But the major pressures in developing nations are really land for agriculture, and space for development for their cities to expand into suburbs and industry. It's really to clear space. And so some of the solutions for forestry are also going to be solutions for urbanization, solutions for agriculture. Can we grow intensively and not need as much room for agriculture? Can we investigate meat alternatives? Because a lot of this, especially in Brazil, but a lot of this is then, and if you look in Australia, losing a lot of forests for grazing, to create land. Freeze, ask as many, oh, there we go. Yeah, it's just being ridiculous. To ask as many questions as possible. How will you organize this information so that you can explain how integrated pest management uses cultural, physical, chemical, and biological approaches? I know, I'm going to read it to you. I don't know what to do. I did this last time too in the middle of it. I can try to unshare my screen, but since we're short on time, that's better. Okay, so ask questions. This is what I would say you need to be prepared. How will you organize this information rather than memorize it so that you can create a really good response that shows that you understand the interconnectedness? Can you explain how IPM integrates those 4 different methods? That we're trying to avoid chemical, so we start with physical, we move to cultural, prevention-oriented, then we use biological. Then when we do, we have to use chemical. We try and use organic chemicals and use them at strategic times. And why that's better. Cultural is like intercropping, it's companion planting, like planting marigolds with tomato plants. It's using an ecosystem approach, perhaps the animals that you have that you allow to be, like using chickens. Cultural is also maybe you inoculate, you use certain kinds of bacteria in the soil that promote certain kind of nutrient uptake that will prevent pests. Or diatomaceous earth. It's the combination. Can you control how often about any of these things? What would you measure? And that involves understanding them well enough. For example, if you're going to design an investigation about population density and disease spread in aquaculture, what are you going to measure? How often are you going to measure it? Can you have a hypothesis that that's testable and has your IB and your DB? Can you propose a solution by describing these things and why they're solutions? Can you evaluate those solutions by saying what the advantages and disadvantages are? And if you can do that, on this level, you are so ready. And maybe even write them out for yourself as practice, you know. You don't necessarily have to have all the answers written out, but practicing this level of explaining, designing, proposing, evaluating just will help you then find the information if you come by a question that you're not familiar with. You can do it. You can do it. I believe in you. You are very welcome. And I just wanted to, yeah, and you're doing great by being here and doing a little bit every day. I would definitely say the best strategy is to practice responding to those questions on AP Classroom, the optional practice, and seeing, and then looking at the actual scoring guidelines, so you can start to understand how you need to carefully read the question to strategically answer it. And they're not going to ask you what you can memorize. They're going to ask you, can you put the information together